Hi there, and welcome to another Carson River Report. This is a program that focuses on water resources issues throughout the Carson watershed. I'm your host, Ed James. I'm with the Carson Water Subconservancy District, and with me today is Brenda Hunt. She is the watershed coordinator for the Carson River. Good morning, Brenda.
Good morning.
What we're going to talk about today is focusing on flooding and our floodplain, and of course the risks associated with flooding. Flooding is something that happens throughout the United States, and it's actually one of the largest damaging cause throughout the United States. More damage is caused by flooding than any other natural disaster. A lot of times too, when you live in the desert, people tend to forget that we live in a floodplain, especially when you have a dry year and the river goes dry. But we have ways to protect yourselves and make more aware of how we are dealing with our floodplain management. So before we get started, Brenda, maybe you can talk a little bit about what a floodplain is and why it's important in the Carson watershed.
Okay. A floodplain is basically the level area bordering the river channel. And it depending on the topography, it can be quite narrow or it can be quite wide. So that's just the basic definition of what a floodplain is.
Okay. But we also have to worry, a floodplain is an area that's covered. But sometimes people will hear the 100-year floodplain, the 10-year floodplain, the 500-year floodplain. Can you give a little more definition of where those come from?
Okay. Basically, there are definitions, or generally people classify floods, and they can be classified as 10-year floods or 25-year floods, 100-year floods, up to 500-year floods. And basically, the 10-year flood happens more frequently than a 100-year flood, just to kind of give you some perspective on how that works. Also, it's important to note that a 100-year flood doesn't mean it only happens once in 100 years. It could mean that it actually happens numerous times over that 100 years, but the likelihood of it happening is basically about a percentage. 1% chance. And that 100-year floodplain is also, along with another term called a floodway, is also termed the base flood, which is used in regulations and with the Federal Emergency Management Association or agency,
which is also known as FEMA. And that's really, that's probably why it's more important, because FEMA has designated a 100-year floodplain of dealing with insurance.
Correct.
Okay. We have several different kinds of floodings, or a couple of different floodings in the Carson watershed. Can you explain the different types that occur?
Yeah, I can. So there's three different types of flooding. The first one is main channel flooding or riverine flooding, and that type of flooding is when the river overbanks and the water accesses its floodplain. It's basically when we get rain on snow events in, like the New Year's flood, that type of thing. Those are usually when the Carson River floods in that fashion. Other types of flooding are alluvial fan floods, and those are more flash floods that come with summer rains, and they usually are in areas where we have either tributaries or drainages that come down towards the river from the mountain canyons, and those can be quite damaging and carry a lot of, the water carries a lot of velocity and it's quick. That's why they're called flash floods. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think...
Oh, there's a third.
Oh, yes.
Sorry.
Okay.
There's a third, and those are debris flows, and that's basically when we get an intense rain, maybe on snow as well, and the rain actually erodes the soil and the sediment, and it actually picks up the bed load and the sediment and makes it into almost like a wet concrete sort of texture. And those they can be a very high velocity as well, and can do quite a bit of damage, carry large boulders, any sort of structures with them. So those are, and they can bury people and things. So they're quite damaging. Yeah.
Now, flooding is something that's going on in the Carson, and I think a lot of people say, okay, well, how do we deal with flood issues here in the Carson watershed? Can you explain some of the management tools that are out there and how we actually deal with flooding and some of the programs we're trying to institute?
Okay. Well, some of the programs, basically, there was, in 2008, throughout the watershed, the counties where the river flows through actually adopted a floodplain management plan. And that floodplain management plan uses an approach called the living river approach. And this is basically looking at what we have in the Carson River. We don't have as much development in the floodplains within the Carson River, so it's basically an approach to actually keep the natural functions and values of the floodplains intact and avoid development in those areas in order to prevent loss, property loss, the cost associated with that, and kind of limits and also protects the natural values in the riparian areas, the wildlife, the fish in the system.
Okay. Well, what is the benefit of a floodplain?
Well, the benefits of a floodplain there are a variety of them. One is that it actually stores the water during a flood event. It actually it lowers the velocity of the water. It can basically filter the water so that there's better water quality. It lowers the erosive sort of properties of a river if it's really incised and the velocity of the water is running quite quickly. It can cause a lot of erosion, and if the river can access its floodplain, it kind of lowers that. It also lowers the temperature of the water, so it doesn't impact the system as much as well. Those are just some of the things.
Well, I know when you start looking at flooding out there, and a lot of times people say, well, why don't you build more dams or levees and control the flooding versus letting the water flood? Can you explain why the living river approach is a different and lower cost than these other alternatives?
Yes. So what happens if you start to build levees and you channelize the river? Think LA River, full on straight channel, things just moving, velocity, let's get the water out of here. You limit, the costs associated with that are extraordinary, first off, and not only in the initial stages of putting in the structures, but also in the long-term maintenance of those structures and making sure that they're maintained, forever. Because what happens when you channelize a river, then more development happens and people think they're safe from the flood, and that doesn't always occur. So the situation that we have in the Carson Valley is in the Carson River, actually throughout the whole watershed, but in particular in the Carson Valley, is that we have a lot of open areas, agricultural areas, open spaces that are allowing the river to access its floodplain. Currently, it's a natural situation, and that's kind of a free benefit. We don't have any costs associated. There's no risks or limited risks with the current situation. We also have an example of the Truckee River to our north, where you can look at what happened with the costs. For instance, in the 1997 flood, we had about, throughout the Carson River watershed, the costs were about just less than $4 million. In damages throughout the whole watershed, so all the counties within the watershed. In Washoe County alone, in the Truckee River, the costs were over $16 million, so 4 times the amount, because they have developed their floodplains and the costs associated with structures that they need to be rebuilt, and then also, the property damage alone, let alone the structures to maintain the flood protections that needed to be replaced and maintained over time. It's pretty phenomenal.
And those numbers there were just along the river. It didn't
Right.
include the damage to the hotels that occurred. A lot of the things I believe it was several hundred of millions of dollars of damage in the Washoe area that occurred,
Right.
all the physical damage to the river structures.
Right.
And I think if you look at the overall picture too of, dams and levees, we have very little upstream storage on the Carson.
Correct.
But on the Truckee, they have several upstream storage, and yet that still did not protect the lower watershed in the Reno area and Sparks. And so again, building these infrastructures do not always protect
Right.
and are always much more expensive. And we always tend to build these structures and they tend to fail.
Correct.
And so when they fail, of course, then you try to go back and fix it. And if you look at the cost benefit to the communities, keeping an open floodplain is much more cost effective than to construct in it. Also, typically what happens is you start building levees, and then people think they are safe, and so they start getting closer and closer. You get more development, and then when it fails, the dollar amounts are much, much higher. And we see this throughout the United States.
Yeah.
Look at New Orleans, look at the Sacramento Delta, all these places that are built along the floodplain, the Mississippi.
Right.
All these areas are good indications of why building in a floodplain has never been cost effective, and the whole community pays for it.
That's right.
It's not just individuals. If you look at the Truckee River, at one time, to protect the Reno area, they wanted to spend up to $1.6 billion. And now the federal government is saying, well, we don't have the money, so they're cutting back. So the project is not going to be as expensive. But that community is going to be spending millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, to get back to what we have currently on the Carson.
Right.
So if you start looking at the cost benefit of that, building in a floodplain will never pay for itself. And keeping agriculture in there, keeping a healthy environment along the river is so much more important than to construct it, constrain it, and look at that. Even Los Angeles now is trying to rip out some of their flood channels because they
Right.
want a healthier environment.
Exactly. And if you start that process, you need to do it from the top to the bottom. So think about, all the way Alpine County, all the way down to Churchill County. You'd have structures or a channel.
That's correct. Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little more about how we are planning to deal with flooding and also our resources. Hi there, and welcome back to the Carson River Report. I'm your host, Ed James, with the Carson Water Subconservancy, and with me today is Brenda Hunt. She is the watershed coordinator. Today we're talking about flooding and the impacts and how to basically prepare for them when they do happen. Brenda, you had mentioned earlier about this 2008, this regional floodplain management plan that was developed that all the counties adopted. Can you talk a little more about that management plan and what's involved in that plan?
Sure. The floodplain management plan was, like I said, adopted by all of the counties within the watershed where the river runs through it. And it is a plan to basically provide floodplain management objectives and suggested actions to protect the floodplain, to make people aware of flooding issues throughout the watershed. And it goes through, it has suggested actions associated with floodplains, the natural function and values of floodplains, the types of regulatory standards that we need to protect the floodplain and to protect flooding, people from flooding. Also, it talks about flood data information and maintenance, so the mapping of the floodplain and the different types of studies that need to happen. It talks also about the river's channel migration and bank erosion and monitoring those effects during and after flood events. And it also, I'm just going to look at my notes real quick, talks about floodplain, flood hazard outreach and education, and the types of things that we want the public to know to be prepared about floods, and so that they know if their property is or isn't in a floodplain, and what to do once you have that knowledge. And then also, it also talks about the reduction of infrastructure impacts. So, what do we do in certain locations where we have infrastructure that's already in place, such as bridges and roads and the like, that may be causing potential causes of hazards during flooding events. So that's kind of the basics. Is there?
Well, I think one of the things that we're now working on, one of the suggested actions, is to remap the floodplain. And this is really more of a FEMA program. It's meeting FEMA guidelines. And there's already a floodplain that was mapped back in the 1980s, which, if anyone knows this watershed, a lot has changed since the 1980s.
Right.
A lot of construction. And those old models were what they called steady state models. And what they did is they looked at uniform flow going through the entire watershed and did not take into account our floodplains. And really, our floodplains are our protection. If you look in Carson Valley, and if you look at pictures that occurred in the 97 flood, 2005, you'll see that water spreads out throughout the entire watershed. And that slows down the flow of water. So to get a better handle of really what's occurring in this Carson watershed and the new mapping, we are using what they call unsteady state model, where it actually takes time and volume into account. And this allows, as the water moves through, to attenuate, slow down, and move through. So then when we do see constructions, we can actually see how that may impact flows up and down the watershed. It's kind of a new program. FEMA usually sticks with the steady state, but with the unsteady state, we really have an opportunity to look at impacts as development occurs also in the watershed. This will give us a lot of abilities to look at future planning. And it's kind of unique because we are moving forward. We're one of the few watersheds that are currently doing it. I think it's going to be a standard in the future because, again, you have a much better understanding. It's a lot more intensive modeling and efforts put into it. And so these are some of the things that I see as a suggested action to get a better handle for management. One of the things I know that you're also working on is education and outreach. Can you talk about some of those programs that you're doing with some of these working groups, but also then with the library displays?
I can. So I work with the Carson River Coalition, which is a kind of ad hoc group of partners throughout the whole watershed. And we have a couple of working groups, and one is called the River Corridor Working Group, and the other is an education working group. The River Corridor Working Group has been discussing this education and outreach and trying to get a handle on, just what do we need to do to get people to understand the importance of floodplains and the importance of protecting the floodplain. We have been we've worked with the University of Cooperative Extension, and they have helped us develop some brochures on for homeowners and property owners throughout the watershed to learn about flooding and how important it is to, if you are in the floodplain and you already have a house in the floodplain, what you need to be prepared for, and think about if you are thinking of purchasing a house in the floodplain, what risks and thoughts you need to have associated with that, and also just kind of the benefits overall of previously, like the things that we've previously discussed on the show already. Other things we have recently had a floodplain protection or conservation display at the Carson City Library in their display case. We are going to be having a similar display in the Minden library, in Douglas County's library in Minden. And I think that those at least get to some portion of the public. We're hoping to maybe more broadly discuss these things. We go to community events. Every one of our education or environmental education programs with the schools or with the adult populations talk about floodplain protection and why floodplains are important as well. So and we've even talked about, and obviously this is costly, but we've talked about doing more of a media campaign that would involve commercials or basically billboards and the things like that.
Okay. One other topic I want to do, because I know this is a confusing topic for a lot of people, is flood insurance. I think a lot of people believe that when they have homeowner insurance, they're covered for flooding, but that's not the case. Can you explain a little bit about why FEMA has set their programs and how you're not covered?
Okay. Well, yeah, I think it is really important to know that as your homeowner policy does not cover you for flooding. And you have to buy special insurance for flood protection. So it is really critical that you know if you are in a floodplain or in a flood hazard area that FEMA has, or a FEMA determined flood hazard area. And the program, just to get back a little bit to the insurance, the program is the National Flood Insurance Program. And it is a financial mechanism that I think it was created through an act in about 1968 to provide private property owners flood insurance, because the insurance is, because as Ed had told us earlier, flooding is one of the main hazards, and the private insurance companies were not able to provide affordable flood insurance for private property owners. Basically, I think it's most people who are within a floodplain do own flood insurance, or they do have a premium that they pay, especially if they have a mortgage. The 30-year mortgage, basically, if you have a 30-year mortgage or any type of a mortgage and you're in a floodplain, the banks require you to purchase the flood insurance. Now, if you've paid off your house and you're in a 30, so you no longer have a mortgage, it's still really important for you to have flood insurance because, again, your homeowner policy does not cover it. So.
Yeah, most likely people don't realize is that if you're in a floodplain, you're more likely to have your house flooded than your house to burn down. And yet everyone keeps insurance for fire hazards, but flooding is a bigger issue there.
Right.
But again, when we talk about flood insurance and the requirements, this is where that 100-year floodplain designation becomes critical, and the mapping on that. And it's important to get it correct, because if it's not correct, like some recent flood mapping that was done a couple years ago by FEMA in Douglas County put people in a floodplain that had never seen the flooding. So it's real important when we use these tools to do it correctly. And I think that's something we focus on local control. Carson Subconservancy District and the counties not too long ago entered into a charter agreement with FEMA to ensure that when we start doing these flood mappings that it's done on a local level with FEMA's funding, but we have local engineers and local input versus an outside firm coming in, mapping an area, may not be familiar with it. And again, if you don't have good data, you can get bad outputs, and I think it's important there. But if you're in a floodplain, it is really important to understand that, and then protections. The likelihood that, 100-year flood, but if you have a 30-year mortgage, that means possibly the chances of 1 in 3 that your house will flood during that period.
That's right. I think it's important also to talk about the community rating system that's
Yes.
associated with the flood insurance. So each community has an opportunity to actually provide lower or premium discounts to their residents if they meet certain requirements. They have to meet minimum requirements, and the rating system goes 1 through 10. And if a community does over and above, increases their ranking or their rating, then they have the ability to get a lower cost premium, up to 45% if they have a #1 community rating. So it's a pretty significant premium discount.
So opportunities to save, again, at the working community, and again, overall reduction in the costs when you have a good, proper management plan. Well, we're about done here. Can you talk about if people want to know more about flooding and the website where they can get information from?
Sure. So we're with the Carson Water Subconservancy District, and you can go to our website at www.cwsd.org or O-R-G and reach us. We have information on flooding. We have links to other websites, such as FEMA's website, which has a great preparedness, how do you do a flood kit and all that type of information as well. So I think those are important things.
Also, the USGS has a great history of all the flooding,
Yeah.
and we have a link there, and that's a good, if you want to see over the years the different floods and some of the old pictures, even back in the early 1800s, yeah. Some of the floods that occurred, it's important there. Also, if you want to contact us, you could call the main office, and that number is area code 775-887-7450, and that's our main phone number. And again, if you have any questions about flooding or issues in this watershed, we're more willing to get you the information. If we don't know it, we know people who we can pass you on to who would have the answers. So thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.